Okay. So today we had actually the subsection of the Indian Academy of Neurology. The stroke subsection was a subsection which formed actually uh, in 2012 only. There was already a stroke. You know that there is an Indian Stroke Association. So there were a lot of debates as to whether there should be a separate subsection. But Dr. Prasad and a few other people in the uh, neurology community was very keen that it should be there. The reason is that uh, a, the they wanted, suppose when there is a official governmental representation of the Indian Academy of Neurology, we had taken several issues like making the thrombolytic drug available in government hospital and subsidized at other hospitals, provision of drugs through Rashtriya Arogya Nidhi and other insurance schemes, government insurance schemes, like for example, Tamil Nadu state insurance schemes. And I'm sure there are similar forums in AP as well, and in other Delhi, other union territories everywhere. So when these were brought to the notice of the government, they were asking, there are several associations and societies for each of these organizations. So do you have separate, do you have a specific uh, subsection or an official body of the academy? Yes, Indian Academy of Neurology. So how do you, does the chairman on president and secretary of the Indian Academy of Neurology represent all your issues, or there are separately designated people? So in fact, a designated separate subsection became the need, and we have taken many issues, like for example, patients with the stroke getting the various social allowances for their for the disabilities. Most of the neurological disabilities were clubbed along with orthopedic disabilities. The orthopedicians were giving the certifications, and the very specific neurological problems like ataxias and the problems specific to hemiplegias, including uh, problems like loss of orientation and anosognosia. All these things were not to be accounted as disabilities. And we have been working on these things closely. And then they told that we had to come up with the guidelines. And then last 4 or 5 years, Dr. Prasad had taken the initiative to form these guidelines. And this was a very Herculean effort. The DG himself was the lead, and he had taken representatives from all the institutes of national importance, a number of medical colleges at tertiary level, district hospital doctors, primary health center doctors, medical students, patients, and also the various other social workers and the new patients in the neuro rehabilitation. And all these people were actually brought together, and then an organization was, and the guidelines were formed by the Ministry of Health. And this was finally released in 2019. And it's at the website of JIPMER. And this is an official document from the Ministry of Health's DGHS website, and a copy of which is also at the subsection of the Indian Academy of Neurology. So this work has to go on to give governmental representation. When any of you working in stroke or other areas, if you have to have official representation going through the government body, it is to be the Indian Academy of Neurology's subsections. So please go through that. Looking at the subsection, looking at the guidelines of the American Academy of Neurology or World Stroke Organization or European Stroke Organization or American Heart Association, bar American Stroke Association or World Stroke Organization, we will see that our guidelines of the Indian Academy of Neurology Stroke subsection has a slight edge. We haven't got the evidences weight into it very deliberately because Dr. Prasad, being interested in deeply in epidemiology, he had his own questions and his own issues against the way many of the evidences have been cited and the relevance and the people's ability to grasp the evidences. If you look at, for example, AHASA guidelines. So he said that we have to, as a neurology community, we have to mature a little more. People have to be able to be readily using it, them to be able to really imbibe the spirit and understand it. So the weight of the evidences have not been put, but it has strictly followed the existing evidences. We have additional to the WSO AHASA guidelines, a significant amount of evidences based neuro rehabilitation for stroke specifically has also been added on. So, and if you go through, you will find that it's very helpful for our own stroke units and to advise our own neuro rehabilitation personnel in our stroke team, and also the patients as well as the primary care doctors and the ASHA and other community workers to utilize that. So I would urge all of you to go through and continue to give feedback into that, because these guidelines will need updating every 2 or 3 years. And there is nothing like whoever is contributing enthusiastically and seriously. For example, now Dr. Bindu is actually starting the, I think it's just around the corner, outreach stroke. So she'll be able to give very important feedbacks. And I'm sure all of you, Sushma has a lot of practice working right inside the heart of the Delhi city and the urban setup. And Dr. Vengama has experience with all the 3 groups and also as a major administrator. So please give your viewpoints after going through this, and it will certainly be incorporated. So, Madam, with this introduction, I would request you to start the proceedings of today's program. Dr. Vengama, can you please take over? I would do the introduction of Dr. Bindu. So after your introduction, I will give the CV part. I will be able to help you with.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil Narayan, and good evening to everybody. And I'm very happy to be the part of this stroke subsection academic programs. And today we have 2 important topics, that is stroke in India and outreach care and novel oral anticoagulants in atrial fibrillation. Like now the current concept is everything on primary prevention. I think in outreach care makes a lot of difference in detecting the disease very early and as a part of primary prevention, because it has to be done at the level of rural or a primary health care where patient cannot come to us. That way, I think Dr. Bindu has taken a good initiative to start these outreach programs with the motto of like reach them and then to teach them and to treat them. I think important aspects, especially the stroke, it can be definitely preventable if you know all the modifiable risk factors which could be detected very early. In our country, I think the stroke incidence and prevalence is at an younger age compared to the West. And that is because of all these modifiable risk factors like diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, all those things. And if you reach people who are not able to come to us and then detect these early, and indirectly you are preventing the stroke. And secondary, of course, the people who can't reach, you can do the secondary prevention as well as the tertiary prevention. Again, people with a stroke disability, you can advise lot of rehabilitation care. I think I really congratulate and thank Dr. Bindu Menon for taking this very important topic of stroke in India and outreach care. And similarly, the next topic, NOVAX, has changed our. Earlier, we used to be so scared of giving anticoagulation with a lot of complications, especially related to cardioembolic stroke. But now, with the advent of NOVAX, we are very comfortable. Again, is a part of a secondary stroke prevention. We really definitely use it. I think these are all the two important topics which are definitely used for the current scenario. With this brief introduction, I request Dr. Sunil Narayan to proceed with the further proceedings.
Thank you, madam. I think I just there was a dereliction of duty of not introducing madam, which doesn't require. But I think since I left it out, most of all of us know Dr. Bengamma quite well. Any of the newcomers who have not joined, who hadn't who had just joined, or who are who started the neurology training in different parts of India. Dr. Bengamma has been brought up the Department of Neurology at the Sri Venkateswara Institute of Medical Sciences in Tirupati, which is a autonomous institution, a premier super specialty institute in the not only in Andhra Pradesh but whole of India. Lots of us immediately after career had the opportunities to spend time there as faculty. And I can tell you, madam, and you know it very well, that neurology as faculty independently, we started getting experience for the first time under your guidance at Tirupati. And I learned most of my stroke by seeing the patients at Tirupati. The plethora and the kaleidoscopic array of cases which I had seen at Tirupati continued to trigger my interest in stroke, which I pursued subsequently. I also want to tell you that the stroke subsection has now a membership of 158, and the strength of this subsection of Indian Academy of Neurology is that the majority of the members are very young. So that's why we decided to give opportunities to young faculty who are doing extraordinarily good work and who have a lot of information to share with the young budding neurologists of India in stroke area. And I'm very happy that today we have as the, both the speakers belong to this group. And I'm also happy that both of them are our very respected lady colleagues. So we have a forum of the chairman and the co-chairman and the speakers, both are ladies. Many a time I feel that there is an underrepresentation of the ladies as a problem the world is facing all over. As scientists and in other words, their contribution towards patient care as well as to the science is so enormous, but the representation in decision-making bodies and the administration is significantly poor, and there is a need to actually bridge this gap as well. So very happy to today introduce our first speaker first, that is Professor Bindu Menon, whom again, none of the senior neurologists need much of introduction because we have been seeing Dr. Bindu very, very active in various fields of neurology, especially in epilepsy and stroke. She is active quite a lot in epilepsy, but I know very well how intensely she and energetically she is working in the field of stroke as well. I had an opportunity to visit the Nellore Apollo Hospital, where the people were all in so much of respect and appreciation and gratitude towards her for building up an acute stroke care service in Apollo Hospital for the benefit of all the patients in nearby. And there were, I could also listen to stories where she was able to help not only in the very affluent patients who can go to Apollo, but also how she managed to take care of the poor patients who come in time and who are needy, but who sometimes do not have the resources, how she has been helping. And her service has gone beyond the Nellore town to the a vast area surrounding that the city, but also and also the further outreach areas of Andhra Pradesh and many other parts of the country. After her MD and DM and national board certifications in qualifications in neurology, Dr. Menon has also taken from the Queen Square the a prestigious diploma in clinical neurology, and this is one of the best training in clinical neurosciences compared to anywhere else in the world. She is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians at Edinburgh, and of course a member of the National Academy of Medical Sciences, fellow of the Indian College of Physicians, fellow of the Indian Academy of Neurology, and there are many more laurels to her credit. She has a fellowship of the Geriatric Society, fellowship of the Indian Academy of Neurology, I already said, as an Indian College of Physicians as well. There are about 70 articles in national and international journals, and there are 10 book chapters, and she has various awards like H.C. Bajoria Oration Award from the Indian Epilepsy Association and Society, World Stroke Award under the Individual Achievement category in the WSO 2018. She has ILAE Leadership Program Award, which was conferred to her at Barcelona in 2017. She's a research committee member of the World Stroke Organization 2020 onwards, which is a great recognition of academic work as well as the research work. She has been a representative of the World Health Organization Southeast Asia region, a special group member of the Indian subcontinent and epilepsy neuroepidemiology of the neuroepidemiology special group member for the World Federation of Neurology, editor of Epilepsy India newsletter. She has been the president of the Epilepsy Association of the Association's Nellore chapter, and also president of the Neuro Club of Nellore. She also started the now well-known Bindu Menon Foundation, which provides free treatment to epilepsy and stroke patients, just as I was narrating a few minutes before. And this has been active for the last 5 years. And for the first time in the country, she started a rural project called Neurology on Wheels, about which we are going to hear, and we eagerly wait to hear from you. There is the tele-awareness programs for stroke and epilepsy, and also in the development of an app in stroke help. Actually, everyone is waiting to hear from you, Dr. Bindu. So now the podium is yours, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. Thank you, madam. And thank you, IAN subsection, for inviting me over for having, for this one of its different type of talk, I should say, that is an outreach care. We all talk about stroke. When we talk about stroke, we mainly talk about stroke in a different manner where time is brain, and we all harp on that issue. But then there are certain aspects of stroke where, as Madam rightly pointed out, that we should be looking at the preventive care of preventive primordial prevention, and it starts from the primordial prevention, where one should stop the stroke if possible. That is where our aim should be. We are in a country which has got a global share of around 18%, and we rank globally across the world as far as population is concerned. From 1990 to 2016, India made an epidemiological transition of disease. And what I mean by an epidemiological transition is that we shifted from the communicable diseases into non-communicable diseases, where in 2016, almost all states of the country were having a mortality rate were due to the non-communicable diseases. And in that non-communicable diseases, topping the list was IHD, COPD, stroke, and it also includes all the injuries as well. But when this epidemiological transition was happening, the census of the population was continuing to show that urban and rural distribution, which was at a disparity. There was continuing to be an urban-rural divide. And if you would see in the slide from 2001 to 2011, though the population increased from 102 to 121, the urban and the rural, if you will see, the urban and the rural divide still continued, and rural accounted for around 83% of the share in the population. 2016, stroke was the second largest cause of death globally after the ischemic heart disease. The crude prevalence rate was 44 to 559 per 100,000 persons. The cumulative incidence of stroke was 105 to 152 per 100,000 persons. And when it was calculated, there was more than 100% increase in the incidence of stroke in India from 1970s to the 20th century. Now, where is the challenge? There was an skew deviation of the super specialists, and they were mostly centered in the urban area, where we all of us work in acute stroke ready hospitals and deliver the best of care in the urban center. But then what is happening to the rural population, where according to the 2019 census, the rural population is 65%. If you would see the study, which I have plotted it down, there is the stroke burden and the stroke care system in Asia. And if you would look at India and the Pakistan, the round is for that India there, you would see that the neurologists per 1,000 population is less than 1. And even that neurologist is primarily centered in the urban area and not in the rural area, as all of us know that. Just taking through some of the few studies which has been done recently, the study profile and the outcome between, this is an Indian study from Dr. Jairaj Pandian's group. This is the data from Ludhiana, the population-based stroke registry. And they tried to see this was an urban population-based registry comparing to the rural, and the multivariate analysis showed that the rural population were younger, they were farmers, housewives, and consumed alcohol. So only to say that there is definitely a difference in the regional and socio-cultural practices, and it would vary from across the country, because all of us know that the practices, the eating habits, and the other socio-economic cultures also differ across the country between the north, south, east, and the west. This is another study, and it is a very robust study, and which really impressed me, I should say. This is a high prevalence of stroke in rural Gadchiroli. This is an area in the country which is probably one of the most underdeveloped districts of India, which had a house-to-house survey of around 45,000 people, and they conducted in 39 villages. They found that the mean age was 60 plus 14.7 years. The crude prevalence was 388. The age standardized prevalence was 435. The stroke was more prevalent in men than in women, and the stroke was accounting for the leading cause of death in 1 in 7 deaths. Now, if you would see this study, this has been published in 2016, and if you would have a chart of all the other studies which has been done over the years, you would see that the crude prevalence of stroke in the rural India is continuing to increase. So in 2014, the study which was done in Maharashtra had shown the prevalence rate to be around 400 per 1,000 per 10,000 people. And you would see that in this, it was around 535 per 100,000 population. So is the incidence of stroke in the rural population increasing, and whether the risk factors probably are same or different, but are definitely under addressed. Now, what can be done? We will never be able to treat every stroke in the country for a long period of time. So where should our emphasis lie? All of us know, even in the best of the stroke-ready hospitals, we do not have patients reaching out either in the time window for intravenous thrombolysis or for an interventional endovascular treatment. So where should our emphasis lie? So our emphasis should also lie on preventing as many strokes as possible, will probably be the best stroke care that we can provide. And as all of us know, even the World Stroke Organization has pointed out that more than 80% of strokes are the consequence of a modifiable risk factor, which include the obesity, hypertension, stroke, smoking, diabetes, and dyslipidemia. So we, as I have been asked to talk about our project in detail, so I would now start off with our initial step, which we started in 2013 and started the Dr. Bindu Menon Foundation. When in 2013 we started the foundation, we started with a handful of patients with stroke and epilepsy who were below the poverty line and who could not afford the medications or consultations. We're only at 20 or 25 patients, and now we have more than 100 patients each of stroke and epilepsy who are getting free medications and consultations and other tests if needed every month from them. And we can see a real sea change in the patient's conditions from that time. So what are the challenges that we face? And what is the way forward which our foundation has looked into? One is a geographical isolation. We know that all the places are way away from the areas of urban desirable hospitals where the patient can reach. And we also know that the mode of transport for these people to get into the urban areas are very difficult. So we thought that rather than they reaching out to us, the best way would be that we move into the rural community. And that is one of our, and I should say a project which is very close to my heart as well, that is the Neurology on Wheels. The second challenge was a limited education and a poor health awareness. Now, all of us know that if we talk to them in a language which is alien to them, the reception would be very bad, and second, the retention would be worst. So it is very important that we update the knowledge to them in their language. And for that, we started a stroke mnemonic in the local language, that is the Telugu language, which we can relate to them while we are talking to them. This is not only in the rural, but in the urban, when we go to the schools, colleges, or any of the social organizations. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has also said that one of the most important reasons why the stroke or the cardiac diseases are not being able to prevent as it should be is the false reassurance of low risk. I don't have hypertension, I don't have diabetes. If I have, I won't get it. That is a false reassurance, and that is why it is important that we keep on re-emphasizing that these are the risk factors for two of the major diseases, especially for stroke, and that can be devastating not only for the patient but also for the family. The post-stroke care, all of us know that once even if the patient has been thrombolized and is in the best care at the acute stroke-ready hospital and stroke center, once the patient goes home, once the patient returns back for follow-up, there are cases where the patient has not reached either to his desired level of freedom, or probably has even gone back on his disability level. So we started the Stroke Help app, and that we found that it was particularly very important during this COVID-19 times, where the patients could, none of the patients, whether it be rural or urban, could visit any of the hospital. Then we know that there is an unevenly distributed healthcare system. Howsoever we may do, but we can never reach the rural population and give them the best care. And that is where telemedicine, which has been into the national program as well. So, but then we don't have a telemedicine because our foundation is not probably a foundation which can afford a telemedicine. But then what we feel is that things can be improvised to take it to the patients, and that is what we did. And we had the project We Care. So let me take and give few examples of how we do about it. And the first is the Neurology on Wheels. So as I said, reaching out to the rural population. Now, this is a study by the Ministry of Statistics and Policy Implementation. If you would have a look on this, you would find that the reasons for travel in a rural and urban India in 2015 and 16, if you would see that the rural India, almost 80% travel for health and medical reasons. So you can understand that the urban and the all India in itself travels more for health and medical, but then more than 75% of the time they travel. And when they travel, do they reach the real doctor? Do they reach the real person? Do they get the real treatment? And are they able to travel back and get back the follow-ups at the desired time and the need? Now, the first and the second graphs are well known. That is Andhra Pradesh and in the coastal district of southern southeastern belt of India. And that is where we are, that is Nellore, again a coastal belt of Andhra Pradesh. And that's the picture of the Nellore city where we run our program. So as Madam had briefly pointed out, that we have a motto of neurology on wheels. That is the van which we travel into the villages. We have a motto of we reach, we teach, and we treat, because we feel that it is not enough for patients to just go and tell them that you have a stroke and then just give them the medications and run back. We need to also emphasize not only to the patient, but to the caregiver and to the whole village that this is something which you can prevent. This is something where there is a facility treatment available. This is something where with the proper care, you can probably get back to your feet and your family can have a good life. So we reach there, we teach there, and we treat. So what we do is when we, in the we reach program, villages are identified from the 46 mandals by a random selection. And we intimate the village serpent and head about the date of the visit. The Asha, the Anganwadi workers, and the ANM primes them about the visit, and the stroke patients are registered. What are we doing here? We are
India is presently facing a dual burden of communicable and non-communicable diseases, of which stroke and epilepsy are the important neurological disorders. The challenges in stroke treatment include limited number of trained neurologists who are mostly urban, with progressive rural-urban disparity in the stroke care. Adding to that, the awareness about the prevention and recognition of symptoms is very low. There are several unmet needs in epilepsy as well due to the increased burden, the low awareness, stigma, and the treatment gap. An initiative, Neurology on Wheels.
So you would see that our vehicle gets parked into a village, and the number of people who come to us during that time, we take advantage of their presence for the teach. That is an awareness program to the village we run.
Will go a long way.
And in that program, we explain to them about the stroke, we explain to them about the risk factor, the symptoms of stroke, the importance that the time is brain, we explain to them about the post-stroke care. We have designed pamphlets. We give the pamphlets to them and ask them to distribute into the village. We stick posters at strategic areas so that they can keep reading them, any of those buildings, any of those trees, everywhere. We keep sticking posters. So it will be there for some time in the local language for them to read. We have covered around 29 villages, and in each village, we have around 250 to 300 people who may be patients, caregivers, just bystanders who have come to visit us. And in that way, we have been able to educate more than 10,000 people. And in this way, we bridge the ignorance gap. The last is we treat. After the reaching, after the teaching, we start off our treatment program, and there we start screening the patients for smoking, alcohol, hypertension, check the weight, obesity, stroke, and epilepsy also. We counsel the patients for risk factors, smoking, alcohol, dietary habits. We conduct an EEG for the epilepsy, but then that's different from the stroke, so not mentioning here. Treatment is given for hypertension and stroke for a period of 1 month. The patients are counseled and directed to the nearest primary health center for the regular medications. In rest of the cases where the patients say that, and we feel that they really need specialized and supervised care, they are adopted under the foundation monthly caps. So in this way, we improve the delivery and coordination of the community services. So we have been able to reach 29 villages, educated more than 10,000 people, screened 250 by 300 per village. We have been able to detect new cases, not the ones who were hypertensive and not taking medication, new cases around 294 in these 29 villages, diabetes around 74, and stroke around 111. So we have been able to bridge the gap of distance, bridge the gap of ignorance, and bridge the treatment gap. The next challenge was limited education and poor health awareness, in which the knowledge update we need to have is in, as I mentioned, that it should be in their own language, that is vernacular language. One of our own studies, which was published in the stroke and cerebrovascular diseases, we found that only 14% of responders could identify that the patient had stroke, and 35% could identify the warning symptoms of stroke. So what will happen if I speak to a person in FAST, F-A-S-T, will he be able to understand what a stroke? He probably might not, but then if I speak to him in a musical language, which he understands, that is Sare Gama Pada Nisa, and that's the Telugu language, madam will understand, the stroke awareness can be understood. And this is our late Balasubramaniam sir, who rendered his voice for the Saregama Padanisa, and that we utilize for our educational programs. So reach out in their own language so that they can understand. The next is a false reassurance of low risk. As we said, that India is a country, it is growing rurally as well as urban, but then you see the number of connections that the people have, the number of phones that the people has is also exponentially increasing, and it is also second in the whole world. So we utilize this way to reach out to people, that is an outreach, that reaching out through an electronic means, that is a tele-awareness program. Anybody could dial on this number 1800-891-6977 and could he listened to a recorded message about stroke and epilepsy and also migraine actually included here. And this, they can know about the facts. Most of the times it is not really important for them to know a huge fund of information where they get confused. It is only important to know the warning factors, the risk factors, and what they should know, what is the time, golden period, and that will give the gist of how a stroke can be prevented and treated in time. We also thought about post-stroke care. So we are trying to do about a primordial prevention. We're doing a primary prevention. We are doing acute stroke care treatment at our hospital. We have a stroke ready center. We are doing the thrombectomy. Everything is going on place. But what is happening to the post-stroke care, which is being neglected? And I should say that when we talk in the research committees in the World Stroke Organization, it's as well, everybody feels that post-stroke care is the one which is most neglected. And for that, we started the Stroke Help app. Availability of services is a wide gap between the demand and the supply of stroke rehabilitation. Affordability, all of us know that a person cannot afford a physiotherapist at his house or to go there every time. Information and knowledge barriers, whether it is really important, how could a physiotherapy help me come out of a stroke which is in the brain? So the stroke rehabilitation runs through a spectrum, that is from the stroke unit, where we start the multidisciplinary inpatient services, where in admission itself, the rehabilitation, and the early supported discharge, and the home and community-based discharge. The home and community-based discharge rehabilitation are the ones where we should be probably focusing on in a later period of time. But at this point of time, we thought that we will start on a tele-rehabilitation, that is a delivery of rehabilitation services via information and communication technology. And we started the Stroke Help app. If you could just put in the Stroke Help in the Google Play Store, it's only in the Android phone at this point of time. And Stroke, you could see that in this list, it would come as Stroke Help. And if you could open, this is the logo of the Stroke Help. And there are 27 lessons in that, which contains limb exercises, hand and dexterity, coordination and balance and vision. And with all of those exercises, which has been done by a trained neurophysiotherapist on a volunteer. And these are the simple instruments which the person can do it at home, which has been taught and which has been kept on the app, which is convenient, which they can be done repetitively. There is a flexibility and control over the physiotherapy. They need not to be present at 9:30 in a particular hospital for the physiotherapist to be getting the exercises done. And it obviously very simple to use. If you'll use that, open up the app, you just have to register on it, and it is freely available. It is not chargeable to the patient. So I'll just show a glimpse of the few exercises which would be there.
Of these exercises will help in neuroplasticity and make your brain to control your movements better. The physiotherapist is teaching all the exercises to you in these videos. All exercises are to be done under supervision. This initiative is only an attempt to help the patients and caregivers to support in their journey of stroke. Any discomfort or problems while doing exercises, they need to stop immediately and consult their respective doctors. The exercise.
So it's a very easy, handy tool for patients. And in this, particularly in this COVID-19 times, we found that it was extremely useful for patients. And we're also doing a blinded trial to see that how a stroke rehab app can help the patients in the future. The last was the unevenly distributed healthcare system, in which the telemedicine, that is WeCare, wherein the pre-hospital acute stroke and the post-stroke care, this is really not kicked off very well because of the COVID-19 and because we couldn't send our volunteers, but we use our simple tool of the webcam, and we talk to the patients who have already been seen our Neurology on Wheels, and we have the charts with us who also were the stroke and the epilepsy patients, and we try to see whether the compliance of medications are being done. And we hope that once in 2021 the COVID-19 settles down, we would be able to take this still further. So there is a stroke system of care which starts from the community education, the primordial, the primary, the EMS response, acute stroke care, secondary prevention, stroke rehabilitation, and there's a continuum quality improvement, from where we feel that the rural area is one which is suffering. Everything might be probably is going fairly well in the urban areas, but there is something which really needs to be done, and that is why an outreach program is absolutely essential. And as Dr. Sunil Narayan just mentioned, that the Indian Academy of Neurology has also agreed to have a subsection, that is neurology outreach program. Dr. Piyush as a chairman and myself as a convener, and we invite more and more people who are like-minded and who wish to be a part of this program. And any of these projects of mine, from the Neurology on Wheels to the inpatients, to the outpatients, to the stroke care or the epilepsy care, would not have been possible with a number of support intermittently at different periods of time, who have been pillars for us and standing behind us in their support and care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bindu. That was an amazing talk. I mean, one could see how you have very, with a lot of thought and a lot of passion, how you have designed this entire outreach program. And it shows off your knowledge as well as your dedication, along with a real interest and devotion to get the care to those needy people, devoting almost your entire prime part of your life to the care of the people where you are working, to provide the best in areas where you have your expertise and your acumen to offer to. So this is really commendable, and there is no surprise that you have won so many laurels, and certainly you are going to win more and more of them. And certainly you are a champion and a model for all youngsters who always think of what the nation or the universities and the education and community can do for them. And the best way to get everything in for you is to offer your help and your expertise to your nation, to your community and your society. And once you start doing this, the enormous returns that you get is the satisfaction and the love and affection of the patients. And along with that, of course, as Dr. Bindu has been getting all sort of laurels also follow. But the care and the satisfaction that you get from your care and the love and respect you earn from your patients, the way the science benefits from all these things, they all go hand in hand. And thank you, Dr. Bindu. You have been really a champion of the care and outreach, stroke and neurology, and a role model for all budding youngsters in neurology and stroke care. Dr. Vengama, you have any comments on this specific talk? Or we will...
I just would like to say it's congratulations, Bindu, for a wonderful work you're doing to reach the unreached population, how to go with the amount of commitment and compassion. I think it's a really good, this one. This camp, like 29 villages, you go regular day, or you take the help of that 104 vans, they have a regular, how you are going to, like, yourself make it every month to those 29 villages, or how you make?
Madam, every month to 29 villages is not possible, because one week, every month we have our own foundation camp in the hospital itself, where these 200 patients do visit us. And it has to be done on a Sunday, because clinical work can definitely not suffer.
I know.
Outpatients cannot suffer. So this is spaced across the, initially it was, we chose the village which was very far. Far means it's, one is a distance, but then it is very far from the hospital areas, which is very rural, where there are no PSCs across to it. And we contacted them, and we asked the main person in that, and usually it is a sarpanch or any senior member of that place, and then they approached us, and then they would give an information to, they would just stick some papers onto that, and that we have to help them to give the papers that in such a day the camp will be held and you will have to come. 104 and 108 or any of these, we are not taking any help. We are doing it as a standalone from our own team itself.
Like how the follow-up of these patients, you do it again?
We started this We Care, but then as soon as we started, the COVID-19 stuck. So there became a big gap, because we had the list of those patients and we had the list of the main person in that village. We just wanted our volunteer to reach there and sit on this laptop the way we actually, before COVID-19 stuck, I had designed this virtual platform for them, and I showed some clips of that. I already finished it for one village, and then probably everything became virtual, but I can't send my volunteer there because I can't ask him to go to a village in this COVID-19 time. So
Dr. Vengama, yeah. So what Bhavesh says that we'll come back after Dr. Sushma's next talk, and then according to the time that he's able to provide, we will have to have the question and answer session. So if it's fine with you, we will proceed to the next talk and then come back after for the discussions. He is just checking about the time available. So is it okay? Can I introduce the next speaker? Dr. Vengama?
Okay, ma, go ahead.
So the next speaker is another budding young neurologist, very enthusiastic person, and I'm happy. I'll be a little biased because she's our first DM student of JIPMER, but she has been a great source of inspiration to our entire department, because she herself was a very scholarly and a very soft and learned person. She had academic prowess. She had exhibited at the highest levels throughout her career. She came from all the way from Jammu Kashmir. From Jammu University, she had she passed her, during her, she was the first rank in the Kerala, in the Jammu State Board, and then at the university level, again she had, she was the 9th rank in the entire state for the SLC, and at the pre-degree level, she was the university for the whole of J&K State Board. She was the first rank holder. And you know, Jammu Kashmir always produces a lot of very intelligent students going all over India as well as all over the world. And to have come up from a state with a lot of challenges, she used to tell us the kind of problems she had faced during her studies and her way all the way up to her medical course. She did her medicine in 2002 from Government Medical College, Jammu Kashmir, from Jammu, and then MD from Srinagar Government Medical College, that is the Kashmir University. The MBBS was from the Jammu University and the MD from the Kashmir University. And then she joined JIPMER, and she had done her DM in 2012, and she came off very colorfully during her DM course. She also wrote a paper on intracerebral hemorrhage, looking at our cerebral hemorrhage data, and was published in the Annals of Indian Academy of Neurology. She also took national board in 2014, and subsequently she has been, we all thought she would be going purely into academic career, but then there were different challenges. She joined her family, and she was initially, she worked in various hospitals in Delhi, but all at the same time keeping a very academic and curious mind. And at the moment, she's at, she had worked in the Asia Hospital at New Delhi, and again at the Metro at the moment she's at the Metro Multi-Specialty Hospital in Faridabad. She also has other qualifications in epilepsy, but a person doesn't stick to epilepsy at all. She is a very popular physician, I must say, neurologist and stroke physician. Several of the patients whom she has taken care of in Delhi had somewhere or other got, including some of my relatives, got in touch with me and had very high opinion about her. Dr. Sushma, you are again another source of inspiration to budding neurologists and young stroke neurologists in India. We look forward to listening to you on the subject of novel oral anticoagulants in treatment of atrial fibrillation, in stroke prevention and treatment of AF-related strokes. Dr. Sushma, please.
Thank you so much, sir.
Can you?
Yes, I'm sharing my screen.
Your slide is visible.
Yes, I'm just. So at the outset, I would like to say that there can be no greater privilege than to be introduced by your mentor. Whatever neurology I know, I owe to you, and whatever I don't know is my own. Thank you so much for your kind words, sir. And with this, I would now go on to my presentation, which is about atrial fibrillation and update on novel anticoagulants. So to begin with, what is atrial fibrillation? Atrial fibrillation, as we all know, is an irregular heart rate, often also abnormally fast. And atrial fibrillation occurs because of abnormal electrical impulses firing in the atria, which override the heart's natural rhythmic pacemaker. Atrial fibrillation reduces the heart's efficiency to pump blood to the rest of the body. We identify atrial fibrillation from the ECG. Most of us know about it, the absence of visible P waves and narrow QR complexes which are irregularly irregular. There is no repetitive nature to the irregularity. So that is how we identify atrial fibrillation. There are many causes of it. It's quite a common condition actually. And there are many causes of atrial fibrillation, which include cardiac causes as well as non-cardiac causes. Among cardiac causes, we have like ischemic heart disease, valvular diseases like mitral stenosis, mitral regurgitation, mitral valve prolapse, hypertension, congestive cardiac failure, left ventricular failure, then hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. Then we have idiopathic or non-valvular atrial fibrillation. And then we have non-cardiac causes like alcohol intake, COPD, thyrotoxicosis, OSA, infections like pneumonia, and pulmonary embolism. Some of these causes are reversible, and in some of these cases of non-cardiac AF, the treatment of the underlying cause may reverse atrial fibrillation. A brief introduction to the terminology in atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is classified as paroxysmal, persistent, long-standing, persistent, and permanent. Paroxysmal atrial fibrillation is the atrial fibrillation which terminates within 7 days, usually within 48 hours, spontaneously or with intervention. It may recur. Persistent atrial fibrillation, any atrial fibrillation which lasts longer than 7 days, including the episodes which are subsequently terminated by cardioversion, are termed as persistent AF. Once atrial fibrillation has lasted more than 7 days, there is a chance of remodeling of the left atrium and the change in the structure of the heart. So it has implications. Persistent AF has implications over and above paroxysmal AF. Usually a persistent AF implies a progressive pathology. A continuous AF lasting for more than or equal to 1 year decided to adopt a rhythm control strategy when it is decided to revert it to normal sinus rhythm is termed as long-standing persistent. Whereas an atrial fibrillation which is accepted, I hope I am audible, sir, because it showed that the internet connection was unstable. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. No issue. You can hear you very well. The slides are also seen.
So am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are audible. We can hear you well. No, we can hear you well.
Okay, fine, sir. And all right, sir, I'll go ahead then. And permanent atrial fibrillation is the atrial fibrillation which is accepted by the patient as well as physician, and therefore rhythm control interventions are no longer pursued and only rate control strategy and stroke prevention strategy is pursued. Atrial fibrillation can present with a variety of symptoms, including dyspnea, chest discomfort, syncope or dizziness, palpitations. It can be asymptomatic, or the relevant to neurology, atrial fibrillation can present with or lead to stroke or transient ischemic attack. In fact, up to 1/3 of atrial fibrillation patients may not report any symptoms. Prevalence of atrial fibrillation increases with age. The global prevalence is 1 to 2% of general population, and about 25% of individuals above the age of 40 will develop atrial fibrillation at some point of time. Now with this, on the background of this introduction, now coming to our main focus of this talk is about atrial fibrillation and stroke. So patients with atrial fibrillation are 5 times more likely to have a stroke than those without atrial fibrillation. And 20 to 30% of ischemic strokes are associated with atrial fibrillation. The pathogenesis of these strokes is atrial fibrillation leads to quivering or irregular beating of atria, which leads to stagnation of blood in the atria. And this leads to a clot formation, and this clot can embolize to the brain and cause a cardioembolic stroke. So how do we manage this risk? So what is the clinical evidence to manage stroke risk in atrial fibrillation? Well, oral anticoagulation is the standard of care for stroke prevention in atrial fibrillation. As per a meta-analysis in 2007, aspirin was shown to reduce the relative risk reduction of ischemic stroke in atrial fibrillation versus placebo for aspirin alone was found to be 22%. However, aspirin could not prevent disabling strokes, and the data in favor of aspirin was not found to be statistically very significant. Vitamin K antagonists, the conventional oral anticoagulants like warfarin and dicumarol, were found in another study to be 40% more effective versus aspirin, to provide a 40% better relative risk reduction versus aspirin in prevention of a stroke in atrial fibrillation. Recent studies after the introduction of NOACs have shown that NOACs have a further 19% more relative risk reduction versus the vitamin K antagonist. So this is the level of evidence. And antiplatelet monotherapy, it's very pertinent to mention that it is not recommended for stroke prevention in atrial fibrillation patients, regardless of stroke risk. After the introduction of NOACs, the role of antiplatelet monotherapy for stroke prevention is it's not recommended anymore. So coming to the warfarin monotherapy, which is warfarin therapy, which has been the conventional approach to stroke prevention in patients with atrial fibrillation. As we know, it is effective with a relative risk reduction of 64% versus placebo and 40% over aspirin. However, warfarin does have its own limitations, which include a narrow therapeutic window, which means more dose adjustments are needed, and which means that patient might spend more time out of the therapeutic range, leading to the risk of stroke or to the risk of bleeding, depending upon whether the INR is subtherapeutic or supratherapeutic respectively. Then there are genetic variations in the metabolism of warfarin, and there are many interactions with the drug and diet. And therefore, again, this means that frequent coagulation monitoring, many dietary changes, frequent dose adjustments are needed. Warfarin also has a long half-life and a slow onset and offset, which means that there can be issues in perioperative anticoagulation. We have to wait once warfarin is given. Of course, we do have the option of reversing warfarin by giving FFP and vitamin K, but then the half-life is slow, and this is one of the limitations of warfarin. In fact, it is seen in studies that atrial fibrillation patients receiving vitamin K antagonists in Asia spend the majority of the time outside of the therapeutic range. It is recommended that time in therapeutic range should be more than 65% for warfarin prophylaxis to be considered effective. However, less than 1/3 of INR readings in Asia were found to be in the therapeutic range, which is way less than what is needed. What happens when just go back. So what happens when the therapeutic range is not maintained? Well, if it is subtherapeutic, there will be a risk of ischemic stroke. And if it is supratherapeutic, there will be a greatly increased risk of intracranial bleeding. So here comes the role of NOACs or DOACs, the novel oral anticoagulation or non-vitamin K dependent oral anticoagulants, also known as direct oral anticoagulants. As we know, the coagulation pathway works through intrinsic pathway, the extrinsic pathway, and the common pathway. Whereas the vitamin K antagonists act through vitamin K antagonism and inhibit factors 2, 7, 9, and 10, the non-vitamin K dependent oral anticoagulants or the direct oral anticoagulants directly inhibit some parts at the common coagulation pathway. We have apixaban, rivaroxaban, and edoxaban, which are direct factor 10A inhibitors, and we have dabigatran, which is a direct factor 2 inhibitor or a direct thrombin inhibitor. These DOACs have certain advantages over warfarin. Like all new drugs, they have some of their advantages, in fact, many of their advantages, and there are also some issues with their use. So the advantages are the rapid onset of action, there are no significant food interactions, there is a relatively lower potential for drug-drug interactions, there is no requirement for close coagulation monitoring, and a high relative, though a small absolute, reduction in ICH risk, intracerebral hemorrhage risk, compared to warfarin. However, NOACs also have some disadvantages or some limitations over warfarin, which need to be considered. And therefore, as everything else, the decision making has to be individualized. So what are the disadvantages or limitations? There is a lack of efficacy and safety data in chronic severe kidney disease. There is a lack of easily available tools for blood level monitoring. So we don't know how to, if a patient is actually taking it or not. The compliance cannot be objectively measured. NOACs are significantly higher costing compared to the warfarin or acetrom, which is a much cheaper drug. And this is very relevant in a poor country like India. NOACs are not suitable for some types of valvular heart disease like moderate to severe mitral stenosis and mechanical heart valves. They're also not suited for some particular disease conditions that lead to stroke like APLA syndrome. And there is some potential. These are newer drugs still, though now we have more than 10 years data with us. But yet, compared to warfarin, with which we have many, many decades data, there is some potential that some unanticipated adverse effects may subsequently become evident. Having said that, if when we compare the characteristics of DOACs with warfarin, warfarin, the foods high in vitamin K have to be avoided, which don't have to be avoided in any of the DOACs. Rivaroxaban needs to be taken with food, otherwise rest of the DOACs have no interaction with food. The Tmax, time to the maximum concentration, is comparable between warfarin and most of the NOACs. Warfarin is around 8% cleared by kidney, whereas dabigatran around 85%, rivaroxaban around 33%, apixaban around 27%, and edoxaban, which is not available in India, around 50%. Warfarin has a long mean half-life, 40 hours, whereas DOACs are more of switch on and switch off. So the dabigatran is 12 to 14 hours. So one has to take the next dose at the scheduled time. Otherwise, one would lose the anticoagulant potency during that window. And rivaroxaban is 5 to 9 hours in young and 11 to 13 hours in elderly. Apixaban again 12 hours and edoxaban 10 to 14 hours. Many trials are available, many good quality trials are available for as evidence for the use of NOACs. Some of them which we are very well aware of are RELY trial of 2009, which compared dabigatran with warfarin. Then we have the ROCKET AF trial of rivaroxaban versus warfarin 2010. We have the Aristotle trial, apixaban versus warfarin 2011. And then we have the ENGAGE AF TIMI trial, edoxaban versus warfarin. So these were all good quality trials. And the RELY trial, it compared dabigatran to warfarin. 2 doses of dabigatran, 110 BD and 150 BD, were compared to warfarin, adjusted to maintain INR in the target range of 2 to 3, and the objective of non-inferiority was met. ROCKET AF trial, a big trial, enrolled 14,264 patients, a double-blind, double-dummy trial. Rivaroxaban 20 milligram OD and 15 milligram OD in selected patients with creatinine clearance between 30 to 49 milliliter per minute, compared to warfarin with INR target 2 to 3. Again, non-inferiority objective was met. Aristotle was for apixaban. 2 doses were used, either 5 milligram BD or 2.5 milligram BD in selected patients. With selected patients, those in which 2 of 3 conditions were met. 3 conditions can be remembered by the mnemonic ABC. Age more than equal to 80 years. B for body weight less than equal to 60 kg. C for serum creatinine level more than equal to 1.5 milligram per deciliter. If 2 out of these 3 conditions are met, apixaban dose is halved to 2.5 milligram BD. In all other patients, it was given as 5 milligram BD, and that is how we also use it in a clinical practice. This was also compared to warfarin and was shown to be non-inferior. Averroes trial, on the other hand, compared apixaban used in the similar manner as in the Aristotle to aspirin, and the objective of superiority was met. Engage F. Timmy compared edoxaban with warfarin, and again edoxaban was shown to be non-inferior to warfarin. The meta-analysis of these trials, again, the combined analysis favors NOACs over warfarin for efficacy as well as for safety. The forest plot shows that the overall combined evidence is in favor of NOAC over warfarin. So with this theoretical background, now how do we actually manage stroke risk in our day-to-day clinical practice? So stroke prevention in atrial fibrillation is about finding the balance between the risk of thromboembolic events and the risk for bleeding. The aim is to reduce, we know that all these anticoagulants come with an increased risk of bleeding. And our aim is to find that balance where we reduce the risk of thromboembolic events with a minimal risk of bleeding complications. We use some tools for it. So for stroke risk stratification, we use CHATS2 WESC score. So risk of stroke is stratified by this tool, wherein C stands for congestive heart failure, H for hypertension, A for age, more than 75 years. And these are the scorings that we give. We all are familiar with this tool. So congestive heart failure, hypertension, age, more than 75 years, 2 points. D for diabetes, 1 point. Stroke, TIA, or any thromboembolism, 2 points. Vascular disease like prior MI, myocardial infarction, peripheral artery disease, or aortic plaque, 1 point. Age more than 65 years, 1 point. And female gender is given 1 point. The maximum score is 9. And the unadjusted stroke risk percent per year increases in general as the score in CHATS2 WESC in an individual patient increases. So just to exemplify, if this is a hypothetical patient who's a female lady, who's a female patient aged 82 years with a blood pressure of 145/92 and a fasting glucose of 160. No prior stroke, no TIA, no thromboembolism history, no vascular disease, no LV dysfunction. So when we do the CHATS2 WESC score, she scores 1 for the sex category, female, 2 for age more than 75 years, and 1 for hypertension. So the total score is 4. CHATS2 WESC score of 4 means 4.8% per year risk of stroke, which is a significant risk. And this patient would be a candidate for anticoagulation. But do we directly go for anticoagulation, or how do we analyze her risk of bleed? So bleeding risk stratification is done by Hasbled scoring, and Hasbled score, several of the CHATS2 WESC and Hasbled risk factors do overlap. So Hasbled again includes hypertension, abnormal renal or liver functions, stroke, bleeding, labile INRs, elderly more than 65, and drugs which can increase the bleeding tendency like antiplatelets or NSAIDs, or alcohol. So 1 point each for these. The maximum score again is 9. The greater the score, the more the risk of bleeding once anticoagulants are started. However, having a high Hasbled score does not contraindicate the oral anticoagulation therapy. Rather, it gives us an overall idea about which factors to control better. So bleeding risk factors can be identified, and out of these, the treatable risk factors to be corrected, like if we can correct the renal function, liver function, patient is asked to avoid alcohol, alternative drugs against the drugs which could lead to increased bleeding risk. So to maintain the blood pressure within the permissible ranges alone, only to tighten the BP control. So the idea is to correct these risk factors, analyze them, correct them, and then introduce oral anticoagulation so that the bleeding risk can be minimized while the benefit of prevention of thromboembolism can be maximized. So the managing stroke risk in atrial fibrillation, as per European Society of Cardiology 2016 guidelines, if a patient is atrial fibrillation and has mechanical heart valves or moderate or severe mitral stenosis, we cannot give NOACs, and vitamin K antagonists are the preferred drugs. If there is no mechanical heart valve, no valvular heart disease of this intensity, then we estimate the stroke risk based upon CHADS2 risk factors. If for a male it is 0 or if for a female it is 1 owing to her sex category, no antiplatelet or anticoagulant treatment is recommended because the benefit does not outweigh the risks. If the CHADS2 risk score is 1 for a male or 2 for a female, oral anticoagulation can be considered, but not very vehemently indicated. However, for all patients with atrial fibrillation, non-valvular atrial fibrillation with a CHADS2 risk score of more than or equal to 2 for males or more than equal to 3 for females, oral anticoagulation is indicated. Of course, we assess for unless there are some contraindications. If there are contraindications, then we can think of left atrial appendage occluding devices. If there are clear contraindications, otherwise we correct the reversible bleeding risk factors, and thereafter in such patients novel oral anticoagulants are preferred over vitamin K antagonist. So a NOAC is recommended in preference to vitamin K antagonist in eligible AF patients. Again, the same thing when the recommendation, class 1 level A recommendation is that when an oral anticoagulation is initiated in a patient with atrial fibrillation who is eligible for a NOAC is recommended in preference to a vitamin K antagonist. And antiplatelet monotherapy is not recommended for stroke prevention in AF patients, regardless of stroke risk. In fact, some of the studies showed a greater incidence of bleeding in atrial fibrillation patients who were on antiplatelet monotherapy versus those who were not on it, although it was not statistically significant. So they say that it may actually harm. It may or may not, but certainly it is not going to benefit. And in the era of NOACs, we should not be relying on it for prevention of stroke in atrial fibrillation. However, like all things in medicine, nothing is absolute, and we must not forget that there are conditions where conventional anticoagulation may be preferable. So what are those conditions? Patients who are already on vitamin K antagonists and doing well, maintaining a good time in therapeutic range, and who are not inclined to change. We can discuss about NOACs with them, but if everything is fine and patient is comfortable, there is no need to unnecessarily change the regime and make it more costly. Patients who have mechanical heart valve or severe MS of any cause, vitamin K antagonists are preferable. Those unlikely to have proper compliance, kind of patients who want to take 1 tablet a day alone, who would not want to take a second tablet, and who may not be a candidate for rivaroxaban. Patients where cost is unacceptable. Those having chronic severe kidney disease with a GFR of less than 30 ml per minute. APLA syndrome leading to increased risk of stroke. And of course, in pregnancy, just like we cannot use vitamin K antagonists, we can also not use NOACs, and we have to rely on heparin, conventional or low molecular weight heparin, for stroke prevention in atrial fibrillation patients during their pregnancy. Going ahead towards some of the situations now, once we are using NOACs in patients, we have to be, as neurologists, we have to be. Yes, sir.
So we'll have to do they have a brain awareness program starting at 5:30 also. So
right, sir.
Yeah.
Right, sir. So if I have 2-3 minutes, can I quickly?
Yeah. Yes. That's
sir,
to do it in 2 to 3 minutes.
Can I quickly? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sure. I'll go very quickly, sir. There are very few slides left. It is just about some of the special situations that we should be familiar with as neurologists when we are using NOACs. So one is a use of NOACs according to renal function. Quickly speaking, for less than 30 ml, this GFR, 15 to 30 ml, apixaban 2.5 BD can be used. Edoxaban 30 and rivaroxaban 15 also have some evidence. Less than dabigatran doesn't have any evidence, and for less than 15 ml per minute, no NOAC can be used. For what about a situation where we have put a atrial fibrillation patient on NOAC, but this patient now comes with an acute ischemic stroke? In that case, if we have a reversal agent available, like the patient is on dabigatran and we have Praxbind, there are case reports and there is some data that we can consider thrombolysis after reversal because it gets reversed very quickly if we have that kind of time with us. And if the last NOAC intake is more than 48 hours and normal renal function, even then we can proceed with thrombolysis. However, if the last NOAC intake is less than 24 hours and if we cannot reverse it, then in selected patients, we can consider endovascular thrombectomy, and otherwise we cannot thrombolyze these patients. Second is, once ischemic stroke has happened, do we continue or discontinue NOACs in patients who have atrial fibrillation? The factors to be considered are infarct size and stroke severity. If the stroke is very mild and infarct size is not expected to increase the risk of secondary intracerebral bleeding, then we can continue the administration of NOACs. The rule of thumb is 1-3-6-12 days rule. For a TIA, we can continue to give NOAC right from the first day after the acute event. For a mild stroke, which is defined as NIHSS less than 8, 3 days after the acute event. For a moderate stroke, that is 8 to 15 NIHSS, 6 days after the acute event. And for a severe stroke, that is NIHSS more than equal to 16, we evaluate hemorrhagic transformation at day 12. We do it also for a moderate stroke at day 6. And then 12 days after the acute event, if there is no hemorrhagic transformation, we can restart our novel oral anticoagulation. What happens with patients who develop an intracranial bleed and who also had atrial fibrillation and who were on NOACs? Well, this is a difficult situation. If there is something which we can readily treat, like a deep, small parenchymal hemorrhage with typical hypertensive location, if we can tightly control the blood pressure, then we can consider restarting after making sure that the blood pressure remains controlled throughout. But this is only after 4 to 8 weeks. In aneurysmal bleed, likewise, once we have clipped the aneurysm, then if it is an individualized decision, and if we find that after 4 to 8 weeks things have settled and patient is having high CHADS 2S score and is likely to have a very high risk of stroke, ischemic stroke in future, then we can reinitiate NOACs after 4 to 8 weeks. Likewise for AVMs, if we have already surgically handled them. So on a case-to-case basis, if we feel that the risk of intracranial hemorrhage has been taken care of, then and it is unlikely to bleed in future, then after 4 to 8 weeks, we can take a call to restart NOAC after an intracranial hemorrhage also. However, anticoagulation for AF should not be offered to patients with large lobar ICH, ideally only to survivors of deep ICH, and as I said, where we have already tackled the cause of hemorrhage. So to summarize, the aim of stroke prevention in atrial fibrillation is to reduce the risk of thromboembolic events and to minimize the risk of bleeding complications. NOACs as a class have been shown to significantly reduce the risk of stroke as well as major bleeding versus warfarin in non-valvular atrial fibrillation, and all neurologists should be familiar. Now, at this time, we have used not to be familiar with NOACs in atrial fibrillation, not only how to use them, but also what are their limitations and how to manage NOACs in special situations. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sushma, for that very lucid and exhaustive coverage of all aspects of the treatment of atrial fibrillation in stroke prevention using novel oral anticoagulants. I'm sure that the teaching material that you have provided with an excellent summary with all the guidelines will be of great use to all the associate and also the young stroke subsection members of IAN. And with your kind permission, we might request you again, notification to you, both to you as well as to Dr. Bindu, to share some of this information with them in case they ask. So maybe a kind of a note material, if you could provide, that could be distributed to the students undergoing DM as well as doing stroke postdoctoral fellowships also in various institutions, including JIPMER, where we started the stroke PDF recently. So thank you very much, Dr. Vengama, for your comments, and we have to quickly wind up. I'm sorry, there could have been a lot more interactions, but then Bhavesh has been letting me know that they have the Brain Awareness Week, another program also today. So Dr. Vengama, would you please?
Yeah, Dr. Sunil. I think Dr. Sushma, it was a very good comprehensive coverage of use of Novax in atrial fibrillation. Like what you mentioned, that Novax main problem is the cost factor, what we see in our day-to-day patients. Like sometimes like the Dabigatran, most of the time we prefer to use it. And when they ask 110 milligrams BD, they take OD and then they'll come back. We have no attacks. We'll continue one tablet. We can't take it two. Like what the data says, we can just leave it like that, or we should insist them to take two tablets. They say each tablet is 110 rupees and it takes 250 rupees. I am going to take only one tablet. Is the data says the lowest doses for any Indians is different from what is the data from the, because most of this data is from the West, no?
Ma'am, actually for Dabigatran, more than the, not the, even the properties of drugs are such that it has a switch on, switch off effect. It is thought to have a switch on, switch off effect, which means that once a dose, it is like low molecular weight heparin. Just like once we have given the therapeutic dose is BD, so the dose which I have taken in the morning will last only till the evening. So it is both an advantage as well as a disadvantage when we think of poor patients who cannot afford a second tablet. Then it is actually a disadvantage because it is not going to, the lower dosing is not going to provide a 24 hours cover. The properties of drug are such that it gets out of the system very soon, and it is certainly not going to provide a overnight cover also to the patient who has taken it only once in a day. Rivaroxaban is the only NOAC which is having an OD dose. So in such patients, if we have to give a NOAC, we better prefer to use Rivaroxaban. It is not recommended as per the available data, ma'am. It is not recommended at all, and not at all recommended to give Dabigatran or Apixaban dose versus a twice daily dose.
So
Yeah, I know, but most of the patients, they start taking only one tablet. Though you prescribe one BD, when you ask them to follow, they say we have taking only one because of financial problem. But anyway, we are okay. We'll continue this. Even if you tell them that Rivaroxaban is better single dose, then they say no. Anyway, we are. I'm just telling you the practical issues which we are facing day to day. But
and if there is a renal failure significant, do you titrate the dose and give smaller doses? Is that usually?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. For Apixaban, now there is approval in USA for creatinine clearance between 15 to 30 ml per minute. Apixaban can be used for 2.5 BD dose. And in fact, many people, there are some small, not a very good quality evidence still, but there is accumulating data for end-stage renal failure also for Apixaban in lower dose, which is 2.5 BD, though it cannot be recommended if we don't have enough evidence to yet recommend it formally. But for other NOACs, less than, like for Dabigatran, less than 30, there is no real data. We don't have data. If we have to use in a severe CKD patient, one should, I think we ought to prefer Apixaban 2.5 BD over the other NOACs as of today. And Rivaroxaban 15 mg OD can also be used for creatinine clearance between 15 to 30. Of course, we have to keep on monitoring creatinine in such patients. At least we have to keep on monitoring creatinine. The rule of thumb they say is that if the creatinine is say 1.3, then monitor 3 monthly. You have to frequently monitor the creatinine and make sure that you don't end up in the end-stage renal disease and still be using. Relatively, Apixaban is safer in such situation.
So I'm afraid that there are a lot of interesting things to actually discuss with both Dr. Bindu Menon as well as with Dr. Sushma on two very, very important aspects of stroke care. One is to reach out to the people. The other one is the use of a very useful novel drug, but with a very careful evaluation of situation. And and I request both of you to give a nutshell of what is your advice as to how best are the strategies which neurologists in India can adopt to reach out to the peripheries to provide the best of stroke care from Dr. Bindu and also from Dr. Sushma as to how to best use novel oral anticoagulants for the acute patient with stroke fibrillation to prevent further strokes. So that with your acknowledging your contribution and incorporating your contribution, we could further improve the existing stroke guidelines of Indian Academy of Neurology. So this has been one of the very, very interesting and useful and important sessions among. We had 7 talks of the World Stroke Day series of Indian Academy of Neurology, and we can't prolong the World Stroke Day series. And but this was already a scheduled Indian Academy of Neurology stroke subsection program, which they are doing it, I think, monthly once. So in the next months, it will be the other subsection. So we'll be coming back to this specific subsection series, maybe only after 6 months. So that's quite a long time away. So in the meanwhile, I request you to actively join and involve in the deliberations of the stroke subsection, both Dr. Bindu and as well as Dr. Sushma, please. And of course, your activities in your own fields. I know that now we are going to be very busy with the outreach program. And Dr. Mangama also, please take part actively in the stroke subsection.
Sure.
And also ask your students also to join the program. And I think I'm getting some reminders to quickly wind up because they are the same platform they have to provide for another program as well. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that was a very important, very useful session. I am sure all those who listen to this is going to get benefited, and we'll also, with your permission, circulate a gist of your talks for the benefit of the youngsters in stroke subsection and the associate members of Indian Academy of Neurology, and also all other people who are interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Bindu and Dr. Sharma, for a wonderful talks. Nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you once again.
Thank you.